Thank you very much, John. I hope I won't disappoint. Indeed, as you announced, I will talk from various sources, but mainly from the Persepolis Fortification Archive, nowadays known to many people as PFA. The unfortunate circumstances that John was referring to actually were also a blessing in disguise, because as soon as this crisis broke, Chicago reacted by forming a Persepolis Fortification Archive project that aimed to document all the tablets by photographs, digital photography, and by editing and publishing as many as possible. And so we are now in our 11th year, and we have done actually quite a lot, so that even if the tablets would disappear, what we hopefully won't see, then still we would have documentation of all of them. More importantly, these tablets, of course, belong to Iran. They have always belonged to Iran, and they should have been back in Iran a long time ago. To prepare for their return, not only logistically and diplomatically, we have also reached out to Iran, and among other activities, I have been teaching in Tehran, and some of my students from Iran are now able to read the tablets and to continue the work on this very important archive as a new generation. And this is something really very, very dear and important to me, to create a new basis for this research inside Iran. We call it the Persepolis Fortification Archive because it was found in the northeastern sector of the Persepolis fortification in the casemate system of the wall. Here you see in the red circle the area where they were found. Most of them look like this. We call them tongue-shaped tablets. There are thousands of them. They are now based in Chicago, as I said, because they were loaned to Chicago in 1935 for 50 years. So you can easily calculate that they should have been back in Tehran a long time ago. There are tens of thousands of them, but not all of them are in a good shape. The ones that we can publish, that we can historically, analytically use, are about 7,000, maybe a little bit more, that are complete or almost complete. We call it useful fragments in Elamite. Elamite, the indigenous language of southwestern Iran, Khuzestan mainly. But there are also tablets in Aramaic, which was more or less the lingua franca of the Achaemenid Empire, and there are single tablets in Old Persian, in Demotic, in Phrygian, and in Greek. And then there's about 5,000 tablets that have no script at all, but have seal impressions. And these seal impressions, in a way, are yet another language, because they express jurisdiction, district, commodity, different contexts, operations, etc. So we are really looking at a very complex linguistic phenomenon. It was operated by Persians for Persians. The scribes that wrote in Elamite, as we can recognize from the particular form of Elamite that they use, were Iranians. They were speakers of Iranian that had adopted Elamite for administration. So here you already see cross-cultural phenomena. And they had also adopted Aramaic for purposes of communication and administration. The territory that we're speaking about is more or less that of modern Fars. It's actually a little bit bigger, which is quite large. It's an institutional economy. If you compare it in size with any modern surface, you can compare it with Switzerland. And that comparison is actually quite apt, because as you know, in Switzerland, not every square meter can be used for agriculture or even for livestock. And this is also the case, as you know, better than me, in Fars. So we have more or less a system of valleys and plains that are interconnected with roads and stations and whatever. But above that, of course, at higher altitudes, the coverage of this institutional economy is quite different. The roads that I mentioned are very important. There's no such thing as the royal road. that Herodotus described. There's several, there's a network of roads. The ones that are important in this area is the one that comes all the way from Sardis in Lydia, in Anatolia, crosses Mesopotamia, enters Iran, more or less in the plain of Dehloran, and then goes around the plain of Khuzestan, enters the highlands around Behbahan, continues through central Fars, and then goes on all the way to India. So an incredible artery of the Persian Empire. The other road descends from the Caspian area, passes through Media, Hamadan, through central Iran, passes through the Esfahan area, descends through central Fars, and then continues to the Persian Gulf. And the institutional landscape that we will be talking about today is very much informed by these roads. These roads were very important. They had road stations that had to be kept up. They had travelers with official authorization from the king or from the satraps. And all of that meant a logistic operation of immense size. So a lot of the production of this institutional economy actually went into maintaining the royal road. So this is one of the aspects I want you to keep in mind. Now we're going to talk about religion, Persian religion in the Achaemenid period, which is a very complicated phenomenon. And if you want to know more of this, I'm going to be very shameless, showing a book that has just come out, edited by Céline Radar here in the audience and myself, which treats the phenomenon of Persian religion in the Achaemenid period from a variety of angles. So I think you might find some interesting things in there. It used to be the case, if you spoke about Persian religion in the Achaemenid period, that Herodotus, the Greek historian, was your first reference. That situation is over. We are no longer dependent on the perspective of Herodotus. And I just gave you a small example. Herodotus, here marked in red, says that the Persians didn't have statues of gods, temples, or altars. All three statements are now flatly contradicted by primary evidence from Iran. There were statues of gods, there were temples, and there were altars. And by now, this is actually also good for our understanding of Herodotus. We understand that he was more interested in creating an opposition between Greek practice, about which he has his doubts, and an idealized Persian practice on which he projected all kinds of Greek philosophical ideas about how religion should be. So not having anthropomorphical imagination of the gods, for instance. So it also actually helps to understand Herodotus better. So these temples, I'm not going to speak about temples, but I just want to show you the archive that we were talking about does mention temples, and it mentions commodities issued for temples for sacrifices in those very temples. And actually we learn quite a lot. There's also a temple in a place called Zarnamia, and in this temple, you see here in red the place name. This place, Zarnamia, actually is a derivative of a divine named Zarnama, which transcribes Old Iranian Zarnava, which means the golden, which is an epithet for a god, which it might be Anaita, it might be another god. This is totally unknown in the Greek sources, it's totally unknown in the royal inscriptions or in any other source. So this just gives you a taste of the sort of thing that we are discovering. Now, the institutional archive centered on Persepolis, but covering the whole province of Fars, also, as I already indicated, took care of regular sacrifices. Part of the production, the agricultural production, the livestock breeding, went into sacrifices. And all of that is meticulously documented. It is not documented because they wanted to inform us about religion, but because they were interested in bookkeeping. And we are lucky enough to find their bookkeeping. Now, among the sacrifices that we find, some are for named gods, and some are simply labeled by a technical term for a particular sacrifice. In the last case, it is difficult to see what is the cultural background. But in the case of named gods, we can say something about it. So the names marked in blue here are gods with Elamite names, and the gods whose names are marked in red are gods with Iranian, or maybe I should say Indo-Iranian names. And in the last column, you see the commodities, the total commodities issued for them, and you see that Humban, who was an old Elamite god, receives quite a lot. He receives even more than our Mazda. So this poses new questions, even new problems in our view on Persian religion. And I could actually go on quite a bit about this, but I do want to speak with you about one particular aspect, which is the funerary cult. Just to inform you, to give you a maybe broader picture, what we have is magi, as we all know, important in Achaemenid Persia. They may have Iranian names, such as the person in the first text called Ukpish or Upish. He's a magus, he's identified as such. He has a bunch of sacrifices that he is responsible for. We cannot definitively say to which background they belong. So here we cannot pass verdict. But then look at the second one. That's a person called Umbaba. That's a very clear Elamite name. And he has an Elamite priestly title, Shatin, which is more or less the parallel to Magus. But he sacrifices also to gods with Iranian names. So here already you are in a kind of mixed situation. And then when I go on, here again you have a Magus called Pirashuka. Pirashuka is very clearly an Iranian name, but he sacrifices to Napirisha, literally the great god, an old Elamite god. And the third text, again, an Iranian name, Kamagina, and again a Magus, and he also sacrifices to Napirisha. And you can go on and on and on. There is no separation between an Elamite section and an Iranian section in this archive. It is mixed. And what I call Persian religion is already the result of this mixture. The Persian identity in the early Achaemenid period was an open identity. It absorbed cultural influences from various sides. And so this has been a subject in recent years that has, I think, developed the field in a very interesting way. The kings of Elam called themselves king of Susa and Anshan. And this duality defined their territory. Susa symbolizes Khuzestan, the lowland, and Anshan is in the highlands of Fars, symbolizes the mountain part of the Elamite territory. Khuzestan was a bit smaller than it is now. The sea coast was much more to the north than it is now. So this is an indication of what is lowland Elam in the classical periods. To that you have to add a large area in the Zagros Mountains, stretching to at least Persepolis, if not further. And a third area, which is often overlooked, is that of the Persian Gulf Coast, which was very essential for the Elamites, with the important city of Lian, which is present-day Bushehr. So Elam, I always tell my students, schematically, you can imagine as a kind of triangle, so like this. Now, if I go back to this map and I project onto it the territory later in the Achaemenid period, controlled, managed from Persepolis, which is this, you see that it overlaps by and large with the old Elamite territory. So on the face of it, it's not just such a surprising conclusion to say that the Persians probably picked up one or two things from the Elamites, because we are talking about the same territory. It would actually be quite odd if they didn't. This perspective is not new, but it has not been very dominant in research. One person who very early on, not in 1980, sorry, this is from 1921, this is a mistake that I made, that stressed this is Georg Hüssing, who wrote a book about the Zagros and Zagros culture, as he called it, and he defined the Elamites as a Zagros culture, as essentially based in the mountain valleys that later became so essential for the early Persians. This is a perspective that was lost in the field for a very clear reason: the French excavations in Khuzestan and mainly in Susa. They have dominated our perspective so tremendously that the mountain aspect, the highland aspect of Elamite culture got snowed under. And it's only in recent years that we have rediscovered this very important aspect. The Elamites were people living in mountains, being sensitive to mountains, being sensitive to the numinous quality of gorges, of waterfalls, of water sources in the mountains, sensitive to fertile plains, for instance, that of the Fakhlian near the monument of Korangun, or indeed the Marv Dasht, where they saw this magnificent cliff, the Koh Hossein, which, as you know, is where Naqsh Rustam is. And on the left side, the left end of this cliff, where you see here two Sasanian reliefs, and where there is an ancient water source, which may have been made more regular in Achaemenid or in Elamite times. In this area, there used to be an Elamite relief and maybe an Elamite sanctuary. Nowadays, it's difficult to see because it has been partially carved over in the Sasanian period under Bahram II. But I can show to you that there are still traces of it, and if you would look at it closely under good light conditions, you would be able to see these traces of the relief. Now, I have to stress that the carving over of this relief, the partial carving over, occurred in the Sasanian period. So for the Achaemenids, this relief was still fully intact and visible when they started to make the royal tombs in this particular area. So I'll just give you some pictures of this relief. Actually, we do know on stylistic grounds that the figure on the left is from the latest part of Elamite history, from the Neo-Elamite period, probably from around 700 or slightly later. This might also be true for the figure on the right, but here I must confess that we are less certain. So, and just to remind you, this same cliff was then used by the Achaemenids, was a sacred place also for the Persian kings, starting with Darius I, who carved his tomb into this cliff. This kind of continuity is now becoming more or less the norm in how we look at things. When in the early years of this century, an Australian-Iranian team did surveys in the Mamazani region, they found quite a surprising number of new Elamite sites. So we are here in the western edges of Fars. Elamite sites, also quite a big number of Achaemenid sites marked in blue, but most surprisingly, there's a number of sites that have both Neo-Elamite and Achaemenid occupation. Now, surveys do not equal excavations. They can tell you only so and so much. It's an indication. What you really need, of course, is excavations, which happened, for instance, at Tape Nurabad, which is one of these 6 sites. And in Nurabad, the archaeologists found not only Neo-Elamite layers and Achaemenid layers, but also a transitional layer from the Neo-Elamite culture to the Achaemenid culture. That is what we had expected, but had never really found. So this is the new perspective that I wanted to give you as a background. This seal, it's a seal impression. You may have seen before, it's by now famous. It's the seal of Kurash of Anshan, son of Sheshpesh. It's an Elamite inscription, a Neo-Elamite inscription. Sheshpesh is the person that you know better as Chishpish or Teispes, known as the founder of the dynasty of Cyrus and mentioned by him in the famous Cyrus cylinder. The image has Elamite influences, Neo-Elamite influences. It also has Neo-Assyrian influences. The language and the script used are Elamite. But I would argue that this person, Kurash, even if his name might be Elamite and his title of Anshan certainly is Elamite, for me is a Persian. He's an early Persian in a world in which Elamite culture is an important factor, which you cannot ignore. And if you want to be something in that world, you adapt to that. So this is what this person is doing, and which was still an important factor in the time of Cyrus the Great. All of this is just background, and I will now go to what I really intended to talk about, the funerary sacrifices. I will first present for you the dossier as it is now, and then at the end, if there's enough time, go back to the Elamite background and see if I can convince you. So let's just start really from the start. Not so long ago, what we knew about the funerary cult of the Achaemenids was not so much. We had Naxxerustam, which I already showed to you, and we had, of course, the famous tomb of Cyrus, of Kurush, in Pasargadae. Apart from that, we had Greek sources that told us about the sacrifices regularly performed at the tomb of Cyrus. And I cite Arrhianus, Anabasis. The tomb of Cyrus was in Pasargadae, in the royal garden. Actually, the word that the Greek uses is paradisos. Round it, a sacred grove with all sorts of trees had been planted. The place was well watered, and you can all observe this in Pasargadae. And deep grass had grown in the meadow. Within the enclosure, near the ascent leading up to the tomb, a small building was constructed for the Magi, who guarded Cyrus's tomb already since Cambyses, son of Cyrus, receiving this guardianship from father to son. To them was given a sheep a day from the king, a fixed allocation of meal and wine, and a horse a month to sacrifice to Cyrus. So this was basically it. As you know, the British excavations in Pasargadae have revealed quite a lot about the place, but not so much about the funerary cult of Cyrus. At the time that the excavations started, the tomb was still surrounded by the remains of a mosque. It was actually used as an imamzadeh, as you know. And on these photos, which are from the 1930s, you can see, and I'm not sure that this was still in the case when the excavations started, that the tomb was surrounded by a number of constructions and remains. To the left, the caravanserai, which was also object of research, but directly south of the tomb also, there seems to have been a construction, and I don't know, I'm not aware of any excavations of it. So there might have been adjacent buildings, and if you remember that the Greek sources speak about a little building for the Magi, you might of course suspected that it was here. We probably will never know, because the whole place was eagleized for the celebrations in the 70s, and I imagine that not much of it remains today. Luckily, however, we have other evidence, and here the Persepolis Archive comes into play. And what I'm going to say now, first of all, just to show you how research is advancing, is coming from a paper that I published in 2003, so already quite a while ago. So we'll present you first what we knew then, and then I will show you what we know now, and also I will admit to you the mistakes that I made back then, which are of course horrible. So this is one text in which the head of the institutional economy, by the name of Parnaka, issues an order saying that 24 animals, sheep or goats, have to be issued to a certain Bakabada and his companions who are making or doing something at the Shumar of Cambyses and the woman Upandush at Naretsas. Cambyses is clear enough, the Elamite is uncontroversial, but Shumar, we initially didn't know what it was, and Upandush also was not immediately clear. Then it turned out that an etymology of it can be found, Upandu, which means from good family, and it can be compared with the Greek name Phaidumia, which may look very different from you, but it is the result of popular etymology in Greek. It does reflect the same name, and actually for the transformation, there's good parallels. This person, Phaidumia, is known in the Greek sources as the wife, the queen of King Cambyses. So that they are mentioned together is, of course, not a coincidence. The fortification archive is from the reign of Darius I. By then, Cambyses was dead. So if it refers to anything at all, it must be something of a funerary cult, because animals are issued in the text that I just showed to you. And this is maybe not confirmed, but at least supported by further texts that speak of wine and other commodities that are issued for the sacrificial table of Cambyses. And the word used in Elamite is bashur, which is a loan word from Akkadian pashuru, which means table, sacrificial table. So in a way, this text is clear enough. We are talking about sacrifices. Cambyses, we know historically, is no longer alive, so this must be a funerary cult of some kind. The sacrificial table occurs in other texts, sometimes with and sometimes without Cambyses. The recipients are the same, so we put it in the same dossier. Then, however, this is a mysterious text. It also speaks about a shumar, the same word, which provisionally I interpret as tomb or funerary monument. But this is not the funerary monument of Cambyses, but of a certain Zishundush, who is completely unknown in the tradition. So this poses a problem. Then a further text, also published in the 2003 paper, speaks of chamberlains. Literally, they are garment bearers, and they are keepers, caretakers of the shumar, and they are active not in Naretsas, I will come back to this place name, but at Persepolis itself. And also these chamberlains, although they receive the rations, they don't actually perform anything. This is left to their servants. So these are high people, they have a court title, chamberlain, they are associated with a shumar, but again, there's no name associated with it. This court title we know from one of the inscriptions on the tomb of Darius the Great in Naxxurustam. He presents to us some of the members of his court, and one of them is Aspachana, known in Greek as Aspartines, and he indeed, in the Elamite version of the inscription, is called a lipte bearer, a garment bearer, which I translate metaphorically, if you want, as a chamberlain. It's more or less the same. So this is a known court title. So why are people with a court title high up in Persian society associated with a shumar? If the shumar is indeed a funerary monument, how does this work? One of the questions that we had back then. So chamberlains, shumar at Persepolis, and then a text with a context that is very similar, where barley is issued to men who are the keepers of the shumar of Hystaspes. Mishtashpa in Elamite, that's of course Vishtashp, in Greek known as Hystaspes, the father of Darius the Great, who may have not been alive also at this point. So we have two historically known people, Hystaspes and Cambyses, then also the wife of Cambyses, and this unknown person, Zishundush. So I concluded in that paper that I just mentioned that we are witnessing here a funerary cult for noble and royal deceased Persians, that the cult was something of an elite thing in which chamberlains, people with a court title, were involved, and that this cult was apparently important enough for the leadership of the institutional economy to be personally involved in its arrangement. They sent letter orders so as to arrange for it. So here you have a little survey. Questions, of course, pop up. I'm sorry for that. One of them is, of course, what is going on with this place, Naretsas? Etymologically, it is the same as Near East. And contextually also, we can place it in the east of Fars. So it is quite likely the same as Near East. Is there a tomb of Cambyses in Near East? And what does it mean if Cambyses and his wife are mentioned together? Do they have a joint cult or a separate one? Is the sacrificial table, Bashur, connected directly to a Shumar? Is it one and the same thing, or are these different things? Who on earth is Sishundush? And then is there a tomb of Hystaspes in Persepolis? When did he die? And what is the exact status of these chamberlains? So although we get a lot of new material, it also creates its own questions. Now, one of these I'm very happy I can get out of the world. Who is Sishundush? Well, it's very easy to answer. Sishundush never existed at all. It was a misreading. When I published this text, one tablet was not available to me, and I had to read it from photos. And this was a hard lesson. Never read tablets from photos and then publish them. Because as I saw the tablets in Tehran later on, by the kind permission of Dr. Nokande, and I cleaned it again, it quickly turned out that the reading Zishundush, which has been published by several people, actually is wrong. It is Upandush, which is the same name that we saw before, the wife of Cambyses. So this already harmonizes the dossier quite a bit. Then this question about Cambyses and his wife, do they have a joint cult or not, which is, of course, is an important question when you talk about the status of royal women in ancient Persia. Well, look again at the text. This is a text in which cattle is, livestock is issued for the cults, for the funerary cults, and here Cambyses is not mentioned, only Upandush. So these cults are somehow connected, but still separate. The king, the deceased king, he received funerary sacrifices, and his wife, as such, received her own sacrifices. Something very remarkable and very important, something that we really didn't know at all. And this again is confirmed by other new texts in which mention is made of the sacrificial table of Upandush in the same way that the sacrificial table of Cambyses, as I just mentioned to you, is mentioned in Naretsas, in Niris. I will come back to that. And here again, I just can go on and on, new texts in which they are mentioned separately, so very clearly separate cults. Then I cited this text in the beginning, people who are doing something rather at the Shumar of Cambyses and the woman Upandush. Well, here it was even worse. I did have this tablet in my hands when I published it first, but it was in the beginning of the project, and since then I have seen thousands and thousands of tablets, so your reading simply becomes better. So I'm now in a position to read it with more confidence in this way. People receiving commodities for a sacrifice, and then in red they are described as who are making or who are serving or who are active at the temple of the sacrificial table at the Shumar of Cambyses and the woman Upandush. So it's a whole series, a constellation of elements, and I will try to make this a little bit more clear for you. And this, by the way, is this text again has a parallel in a new text that we just identified. So we have a temple, we have the sacrificial table that we saw before, and we have this Shumar, which provisionally I have identified as a tomb or funerary monument. Now let's go to Persepolis. Apart from Naxxurustam, of course, in Persepolis also we have royal tombs, Artaxerxes II and III. Now, it has not received a lot of notice that Ali Sami, who continued after the American excavations in Persepolis, Taht Jamshid, had ended, that he discovered some interesting things in front of these royal tombs. As you may know, there's terraces cut into the rock, and when he examined those, he actually found that there had been buildings on them. There's a central corridor through which you access the tomb, and to the left and right of it are little halls with columns, and in one of those rooms, he actually found a square stone slab, about 1 by 1 meter, which had a little channel phrased into it with a little gap for any liquid to escape, and he, of course, very logically concluded that this slab had been used for religious lustration, as he says here. I would now say that this setup of two spaces in front of the royal tombs, in which we have found one and maybe two of such slabs that are, of course, obviously connected with sacrifice, are what is described in this text. So you have a temple-like structure, a sion in Elamite. In it is a sacrificial table, a bashur, and they are in front of a royal tomb, a shumar. I think this actually works quite nicely. One should actually go back to the further documentation that Ali Sami published about these tombs and process it anew, because, as I said, it has been noticed far too little in the discipline. In the case of Cyrus, maybe also, as I said, there may have been such a construction, a building for the Magi, but as I said in the beginning, there are no traces of it surviving now, and the hopes maybe are not very big. Then what about Naretsas or Neris? Is there something there? Of course, I was as curious as you may be now, so I went there, and it's a very beautiful area. Not very frequently visited, I think. It's at the end of the series of salt lakes that determine which are the major feature of this part of Fars. It's also surrounded by very important natural reserves. So the mountains that you're looking at in the far distance are one of the greatest preserves of mountain ibex in Iran, and a little bit further to the east is one of the last preserves of the wild donkey. And even, and I'm going to make a mistake now, I'm going to say Iranian leopard, but it's not really a leopard, but a feline species that is very endangered, also lives in the area around Neris. So it's a great area for the fauna of Iran, and one might imagine, of course, that antiquity, if the situation was anything like today, it would have been a great game a hunting ground for the Persian kings. This seal, by the way, which is from the time of the early Persian kings, shows their interest in the donkey hunt, and of course, in doing so, it echoes, of course, Neo-Assyrian reliefs of Assurbanipal hunting wild donkeys. Now, in Neris itself, you don't find anything apart from the old mosque, which is a Sasanian building. It's often seen as a fire temple. I think it might actually be a palace. In any case, it's very much worth to be reinvestigated, I think. As for archaeological remains, Sir Aurel Stein passed through Neris in the 1930s, and he did pick up Achaemenid sherds, but we don't know exactly from which part of the town. So all of these are questions which are open. Then I return to Persepolis. Naqsh Rustam, I've introduced to you. We know it, of course, well in a certain way, but not by far everything that could be known about Naqsh Rustam is currently known. The mound that you see lying in front of the royal tombs, which hides a wall from the Sasanian period, but also other structures, probably covers cultic installations that could answer important questions that we have been posing today. Here you see it on an aerial photo, again from the 1930s, and here you see it from ground level, and you see that it is quite imposing. And when the tower, the Kabaya Zadosht, was excavated, the excavations revealed actually how deep the deposit is in front of the tombs. But the excavations didn't go much beyond this particular zone, so still a lot of it is to be discovered. Also, the top of the cliff has all kinds of structures that have been noted by archaeologists, but they have never been the object of very profound research. So here also, I would really wish that we would go back into it, also with the new knowledge that we have coming out of the archive. But the question, of course, that I want to pose here, is there a tomb of Hystaspes at or near Persepolis, as the tablets do suggest? In the paper that I published in 2003, I suggested that this structure might be. It is traditionally known as the unfinished tomb of Cambyses. And locally it's known as the Takht Gohar or Takht Rustam. There's all kinds of questions. One of them is it really linked to Cambyses? Well, the tablets suggest not, because they link Cambyses to Oniris. But also the question, is it really unfinished? Nowadays it looks like this. This is a recent aerial photo, and you see that the surface is a bit of a mess. Older pictures suggest that it was maybe a little bit more intact not so long ago. This is a surface drawing by Flandin that is certainly idealized. But if it had been a big mess, he would not have drawn it like that. Ernst Hertzfeld examined the tomb in the 1930s, and he made this drawing. It was only recently published. And here I highlighted it for you so that you can see it a little bit better. And then there is a second drawing that gives you the layers of the stone courses, and you can see that he even mentions bones, but he doesn't say if they are animal bones or human bones. There's all kinds of fantastic stories about this find, even that he found an earring of a type known from Pasargadae, but this object is either never existed or it was simply lost back then. So it's a bit of a mystery, not only the ancient history, but also the recent history of this monument. Nowadays, as I said, it looks like this, and the two tomb-like openings in its surface that Hertzfeld observed, or claims to have observed, are only partially visible. Hertzfeld was adamant that it was the tomb of Cambyses and that it had not been finished, because of the historical data that we have from Herodotus and other sources about Cambyses. But when French stone experts recently went back to this monument and examined the stone surfaces, they concluded actually that the polishing of the monument had started. And as you may know, monuments in antiquity rarely reach the polishing state unless they are considered more or less complete. So you see that the upper course that is nowadays preserved has been polished. And here below you see a stone that is partially polished, and to the left of it, one that has not been. For the authors of the French article about this tomb, it's clear that the monument in antiquity was considered finished. Now, if you compare it to the tomb of Cyrus in Pasargadae, the ground plan is exactly the same. It just doesn't have the superstructure that the Pasargadae one has. But interestingly, Arian, that I have cited before, says that the tomb of Cyrus in Pasargadae was covered with plaster. So if the tomb near Persepolis would have had, say, a brick superstructure, and that one would also have been covered with plaster, you wouldn't have seen the difference in antiquity. So there is a possibility to consider this thing as a finished tomb. Was it used for Hystaspes? I don't know, but it is at least theoretically possible. And I was just hesitating, of course, to bring this to you, but I did it nevertheless, so I'm really open to discussion about it. Now, what about these chamberlains? When this came out of the archive, people reacted. One very important article by Michael Jurser about people with court titles in the Achaemenid Empire, and another important article by Jan Tavernier, who have collected data about such people from Achaemenid Babylonia and elsewhere. And it turns out that there's a quite important layer, a sub-top layer in Achaemenid society, so not the royals and maybe not the highest aristocracy, but just below that are people with such court titles. They often are Egyptians serving in Babylonia, or Babylonians serving in Egypt, serving the satrap, serving the princes, etc. Or they might be Bactrians coming to Fars, etc. So these are really the imperial elite that embody, maybe even more than the Achaemenids themselves, what the Persian Empire did in that time. So it is a cosmopolitan elite of that time. And interestingly, because we started this discussion, these people have become more recognizable. And I will give you just one example. There's a queen one of the wives of Darius the Great. Her name in Greek is Artustone. She appears in Elamite as Irtashduna. She's very active. She has estates at multiple places. She writes her own letters to the stewards of these estates, giving them orders about commodities that have to be transported or given or harvested, etc. So she writes. She is actually a daughter of Cyrus, so she is a sister or a half-sister of Cambyses and Bardia, so here you have her, and Darius married her and Atossa, who is perhaps a little bit more known. Now, this person writes letters, so I ask you to bear this in mind, and one of the people that she addresses frequently is a certain Shalamana. Shalamana has a Semitic name. He might, because of that, come from Mesopotamia or further west. Names are a treacherous source, but somebody with a Semitic name in Fars probably is not from that area in this time. Now we have recently, and by we I don't mean myself, but the ecliptic specialist in the Persepolis team identified the seal of this Shalamana. And this is the seal image that belongs to it. And it has an inscription in Aramaic. And in this inscription, not only is the name of Shalamana mentioned, but also his title, which is Ustabaru, which means chamberlain, garment bearer. And you see a court ceremony going on in the seal image. It's a wine ceremony, and I think we shouldn't push for this image to be a portrait of Shalamana, but it certainly is the social context in which he would have been familiar. And it is very interesting that he presents this with a certain pride. This is his role in Achaemenid society. He identifies with that. This is on his chosen seal image. And so you see that this discussion about the tombs had wider ramifications, and it informs our knowledge about Achaemenid society in the age of Darius. So when we now go back to these texts and we see that these top-end cosmopolitan people are involved in the funerary cults, we start to imagine that they are influential people at the court of a king or a queen or a satrap that after their masters passing away were responsible in part for the funerary cults connected to them. So all of this is entirely new. You will find nothing about this in the Greek sources. Hystaspes, when did he die? The texts are dated, at least some of them are dated, so we can recalculate that to Julian dates, and then you're on 499 BC. And I will not give you all these dates because it's a little bit much, but this Hystaspes, he's mentioned in a few other contexts. One of them speaks of daughters of Hystaspes, and these daughters, royal princesses as they are called, they are traveling. They are traveling to Persepolis from Media. Again, I made a typo. And they're carrying a travel authorization signed by the king. This is interesting because Hystaspes previously was a satrap himself up in the north. So if his daughters are traveling, why don't they have a travel authorization sealed by their father? Maybe because he had died. Then, around the same time, we have people, servants of the palace of Hystaspes, and again, they are traveling. What is going on in these years? Now, if we put all of that together, we get a sort of biography, an administrative and funerary biography, if that's a proper term, of Hystaspes. First, we find him in function. He is not, as some people, including myself, previously thought, a satrap in Media, but he's actually located in Parthia, Hyrcania. And he signs off travel coming from Parthia and Hyrcania and passing through Media. So he's placed up there, Mishtashpa, Hystaspes. So I don't have to show you this, I guess. Then we have some texts on what I think is the dissolution of the household of Hystaspes. We have two texts, maybe three, on daughters of Hystaspes, princesses, coming from Media with an authorization of the king. And then we have palace personnel of Hystaspes also traveling. And then we have those texts speaking about the funerary monument of Hystaspes. Now, these texts allow for a date of the passing away of Hystaspes between the 5th and the 9th month of the year 22 of Darius. But there is a problem because there's one text in which people travel with an authorization from Hystaspes in year 23, no indication of a month. So this is still a problem. There is a solution for it, but again, I don't want to push it. I just offer it to you. The solution would be, since this is a transport of treasure, that means a transport of tribute, of taxation, that it was organized before, as such things tend to do. So people were traveling with an authorization issued just before Hystaspes died. That would be logical, but of course I cannot prove it. So this dossier keeps a little bit hanging in the air. Now I will use my last minutes to place this in a slightly wider background, and then I will open the floor to questions from you. Shumar, as I mentioned, may be a word for funerary monument or tomb or something like that. It's not Iranian, but it also doesn't have a very clear Elamite etymology. If it is Elamite, it must be a compound, because two-syllable words cannot be non-compounds in Elamite. It's just too long to be a simple base. So you could split it in shu and mar. That sounds obvious, but it's really the right split. And because there's a sound law that makes the H disappear between Middle Elamite and New Elamite, theoretically it could come from shu mar. This is an important possibility. I will come back to that. The second part of the compound could be compared with three different roots, and I simply don't have a solution for that. I tend to think that it is from behind, and that maybe it marks a stone or something which is behind a grave, but for the moment this is just speculation. However, given what I will say after this, there's actually a case to be made for the word to be at least Elamite, and this is important. The second term that we have looked at, Bashur, is Akkadian. It's a loan word from Akkadian. This is completely unproblematic. But a loan from Akkadian would not have occurred in the Achaemenid period. The loans that we have that are Akkadian, which are 20 or 30 words, all occur in other older Elamite texts. They were loaned in the New Elamite or in the Middle Elamite period. So in a way, Bashur is also an Elamite inheritance. Now, why am I stressing all of this? You will say, but you told us that the texts are in Elamite, so why is it surprising that these words are Elamite? Well, that's because sacrificial terminology, in part, is in Iranian, transcribed into Elamite, but the origin of the words is Iranian, because it's so essential, it's part of their religion, so they use Iranian words for it, transcribed in Elamite. But in the case of the funerary sacrifices, this is not so. You use Shumar, which I tend to think of as Elamite, and you use Bashur, which comes to this time from older Elamite. And you can compare it to other terms. And here I come with my etymology. There's another term which is very crucial to Middle Elamite religion, and that is suchter. Suchter or suchtir is a word for a kind of shrine in which images of deceased kings were placed. And it is, of course, very attractive to consider this as another compound with such or shuch and a different second part, ter, which may mean something like objects of great value. And there's even a divine name, by the way, which is composed with the same such. So I cannot go any further, and for those of you who know a little bit about Elamites, this will not be surprising, but I think you can make the case for these words to be Elamites. Now, the Suchter is mentioned, for instance, in a famous inscription, a long stele inscription by Shilhak and Shushinak the first. It's quite amazing how unknown this king is, because he has left more inscriptions than any other pre-Islamic king of Iran, even more than Darius the Great, but as I said, not very well known. And he built a temple as a kind of annex to the royal palace in Susa on the Apadana Mount, not part of the traditional temple complex, but a temple purposely attached to the palace to create a kind of dynastic cult. And he called it an outside temple, an exterior temple, a kumpun kiduya. And in this exterior temple, he placed a shrine. And in this shrine, he used to put images in, and I read from the red part, images of Shuduk Nahunte, my beloved father, of you, Kutir Nahunte, my beloved brother. It's very interesting that he speaks to him in the second person, although this king is his predecessor and he has deceased. Of myself, of the lady Nahunte Utu, that is his wife, she's not beloved as you see, and of Shimut Nikatash, my beloved brother. And then follow his children, his sons and his daughters. And then a copy of the same inscription preserves the part that just comes after that. He says, I also put in place images of our ancestors of old and deposited them in the Surtur. So this is a kind of shrine which functions as a repository of images of living and deceased members of the dynasty. And I mean, the continuation and the fact that it is a shrine and a kind of temple, of course, means that he's working on some kind of dynastic cult. The images, of course, are the part that I'm interested in. They are very famous in Elamite culture. Also of non-royals, we have a lot of such heads that are usually called portrait heads, although the term is, of course, a little bit problematic. They played a role in funerary ritual, although we don't know exactly what. But the fact that they are so incredibly numerous in Susa means that they must have been quite essential to Elamite culture. They occur in the Old Elamite period, early second millennium. They occur in the second part of the second millennium, and they still occur in the early first millennium, in the centuries just preceding the Achaemenid period. So they are, in that sense, quite relevant to what we are saying. Then we have, from an Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, who destroyed Susa, we have an account on things that he destroyed and that he took from Susa. And it's interesting that he speaks about the temple tower, the ziggurat of Susa. He destroys it. He talks about the gods and goddesses whose images he took away to Assyria. And then he continues, again marked in red, 32 statues of kings made of gold, silver, bronze, and marble out of the cities of Susa, Madaktu, and Huradi, together with the statue of Umanigash, son of Umbandara, the statue of Ishtar Nahundi, the statue of Halusi, the statue of Tamaritu. These I carried off to Assyria. So I don't think that we have to imagine a kind of portrait gallery in Susa and the other cities, but these probably are statues somehow connected to a funerary cult. And this funerary cult of earlier kings was very much alive at the time that the Assyrians destroyed the city. He even says, almost sarcastically, that he discontinued the funerary sacrifices for the kings of old. I deprived them of food offerings and liberations of water. And actually, archaeologically, we have a lot of indication, a lot of evidence for such sacrifices, but I won't go into all the details of that. Now, some of that seems to carry over into the Achaemenid period, but the evidence is fragmented. So it really depends on your willingness to believe me. Herodotus, there he is again, in comparing customs, funerary customs and royal customs of the Persians and the Spartans, says that they made an image, an eidolon, of the king, and they carry it in the funerary procession on a bier. And this same custom reappears, very interestingly, when Alexander invades Iran and the Persian Empire. And when Alexander dies, they do the same thing with him. And also Hephaestion, one of the generals, as you know, of Alexander, and one of his favorites, when he died also, they made such an image, which from a Macedonian background is not something that you would expect. So this might actually be a Persian tradition and maybe something that goes back even further. Apart from that, we have a new text recently published, which is quite exciting, which is a text on barley for making beer, issued for the daily offerings of the statue of King Darius And the text, as you can see at the end, is dated to King Xerxes, so the successor of Darius. So there is an image which doesn't need to be a statue. It has been translated here a statue, but it might be a stele or any kind of image. But this effigy of the deceased king is receiving sacrifices. So we are, of course, dealing with some kind of funerary cult. Now, we are in a Babylonian context, so this might be something indigenous that has not so much to do with the Persians. But on closer inspection, there's something funny going on with this text. The personnel involved are not priests belonging to the temple, but there are people connected to the royal court, royal officers. And there are not any good direct parallels for it in Neo-Babylonian contexts. There are some sacrifices for the image of Nabonidus, but they are not as explicit as you want. But more importantly, they are from the lifetime of Nabonidus, the last Babylonian king, not for a deceased king. So I wonder, since there is a connection with the royal court, and since it's happening on a quite high level, if you can really divorce this text entirely from a Persian cultural context. I think one should not, especially because, again, in Elamite context, we have quite good parallels for offerings in front of the image of a king and of deceased kings. This is, again, Shilhak in Shushinak, who instates a cult in front of his image. That is in the Middle Elamite period, in the 12th century BC. But if we go all the way to the end of Elamite history, to Atahamiti in Shushinak, who was really the very last king of Elam, even a king, a vassal king, as I think, probably under Cambyses. If not, he just lasted until Cyrus, but in any case, in the 6th century. This man is probably also responsible for this text, which is in the same in writing, cuneiform writing of the same date, and in this fragmentary stele, he or let's say a contemporary monarch speaks again of sacrifices, in this case of sacrificial loaves offered in front or for the image of the king. So this is something which happened in the 6th century BC in Elam, and it might well have carried over into Persian culture. That doesn't mean that what happened here, as we have seen in the Greek sources, and as we have seen in the Elamite sources from Persepolis, was an Elamite affair. That would be much too easy. I mean, these cultural labels and the Persian identity that was developing are not easy commodities. We cannot describe them in black and white terms. What happened, of course, is that the forming Persian culture, which of course carried a lot of Indo-Iranian heritage, also adopted a number of cultural traits coming from Elamite culture and coming from Mesopotamian culture. And these particular cultures had a long history in funerary sacrifices for deceased kings, and had developed a whole set of instruments for talking about it and dealing with it. So I think that if we revisit this dossier that I presented for you today, what we have to do is simply keep our eyes open and include these different cultural strands that ended together in what became Persian culture, a very rich ensemble. Thank you.
Dr. John Curtis has very kindly asked me to finish the session and also ask if there are any questions, but I would like to make a few comments. In the last decades, I think history has been rewritten. And as John himself said recently at the end of one of the conferences, we are still in the infancy of archaeological excavations in Iran. There's still much to be learned, much to be understood about what Pierre Ramier called the intercultural style, but what we can also call the intercultural religion. There was a lot more interaction with all the discoveries in southeastern Iran, in Shahdad, in Jiroft, and especially in Shahr-e-Sukhter. And here I would like to pay homage to the memory of the late Maurizio Tosi, who discovered all those wonderful workshops which show that trade networks were all over the Iranian plateau and beyond, all the way to the Indus Valley and what is now called BMAC, the Bactrian-Marjana complex. Anyway, history is being rewritten in front of our eyes, and we still have a lot to learn. I would have had thousands of questions, but I will leave the floor to others, except for one question, because I had been following the heads from Haftape, which Professor Negahban had dug up. And they're nothing like the descriptions he had written them at that time. Are they kings, queens, and have the colors changed? Because he spoke of red and white and so on. And
very different qualities, but none of them, as far as I know, is convincingly connected to a royal tomb. So some of them might be.
But the two which were shown in Bonn, were they females or males?
It's very difficult to say, to be honest. But the numbers are quite high. There are really many of them unpublished. So not all of them can be royals. This is very clear.
But they're obviously all very made up.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay, well, I leave the floor to the audience. Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Henkelman. It was a fantastic lecture. I will tell our friend Turaj Daryai about it. Thank you. One question I had, in all these excavations done and all the, thousands of tablets that have been discovered and dug out, have you seen or has anybody done any work on to see if there are any traces of Zoroastrian practices or even Mitraist practices in any of these things?
Of course, I mean I didn't mention the word, but I'm grateful that you mention it. The renewed discussion about Persian religion, and also the volume that I showed to you addresses this issue, of course also reopens the discussion about the spread of Zoroastrianism and the formation of Zoroastrianism. So one perspective that people have taken, not all of them, but some of them, is that the Achaemenid kings and Achaemenid culture actually was very instrumental in forming early Zoroastrianism. So I mean let's say the linear development that was expected previously has become problematic, but instead one could also say that it has become more interesting because there's all kinds of impulses from all kinds of sides which are now possible. So that's very much, as Fatima was rightly saying, we are really at the beginning of redoing all of this. I mean, this archive opens everything anew, really everything. It will be generations of people working on it, to be sure.
Would you connect Saryanides' excavation in Gonur with Zoroastrianism as he himself claimed?
It's a very difficult question. Yeah. Could be. I mean, even in Persepolis, there is. One thing that to come back to that, we don't have Mitra in the tablets, not at all, and we have hundreds of texts about sacrifice, but not Mitra. So this is something really, really, really interesting.
We have Mitra in Anatolia.
And we have Mitra in Anatolia, and we have Mitra in the names. So there's many names with Mitra, but he's not mentioned as in sacrifices. So this is still a mystery. Sorry. Yeah.
You have made reference on numerous occasions, including showing seals, to horses in your lecture.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea what breed of horses these are, where they came from? And
wow. I do have some idea, but I'm not a specialist, to be honest. There's a little book if you're interested about horses based on the tablets. Somebody who knows a little bit about nutrition, who calculated what these horses receive on a daily basis, and so what their size or weight could have been. Of course, this is not very precise, but what he could conclude is that there is at least 2 species of horse. So there must be a heavier horse, maybe for military purpose, even for people with a harness or something. And then there's a lighter, smaller horse, which is more usual. So these are very distinct, and they have distinct names also in the tablets. Beyond that, of course, it's difficult if you don't have skeletons to compare the philological data with. But you're very right to raise this point. Anybody interested in ancient animal husbandry, not only horses, but also, for instance, camels, could write a number of very interesting papers on the basis of this material. So, please.
Thank you very much. Could you say whether polytheism and monotheism being practiced in parallel at the same time, or did one succeed the other?
I think that is an opposition that is that doesn't help to understand the situation. It's not either monotheism or polytheism. It is a polytheistic situation in which some gods are particularly important, especially for the dynasty. So Ara Mazda is not terribly important in the tablets. But if you look at the context in which he occurs, there is big sacrificial feasts that have a close royal background. And there you see that Ara Mazda occurs. So it might well be that the dynasty is pushing Ara Mazda more than, so to speak, the people on the floor. So to come back to this question about early Zoroastrianism in the West, that might be an important indication, and certainly something that, from my perspective, is worth looking into more. Yeah. So it's clearly not a monotheistic situation, but if you look at the royal inscriptions, until a certain point, Ara Mazda is the only god who is mentioned by name. That is also a fact which exists next to these tablets. I mean, both of them are true, and both of them are primary sources connected to the core of the Persian Empire. So we have to find a way to understand both of them at the same time, which is a complicated but very interesting question.
There don't seem to be any more
Good.
questions,
Yeah.
but I'm sure there will be over the years.
Good. Thank you.
Hundreds more
Thank you.
questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much.